Hello, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira from the Groundwater project, and we're ready to release another very interesting book for you. And I have here today Jonathan Price. Jonathan Price is a professor emeritus at the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo, examining the hydrology of peat-dominated wetlands for his career and for part of his research. We have William Quinton, is another of the author of the three authors. He's a professor at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the Wilfrid Laurier University. He has studied in Canadian Arctic since 1987 and in the Mackenzie River Valley region since 1991. And Colin McCarter. He is a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Earth, Environmental and Society at the McMaster University. He completed his PhD in 2016 from the University of Waterloo and has held several postdoctoral fellowships, including NSERC postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Thank you very much, the three of you, for your nice book. Your peat and peatland is a very interesting subject. As I told you before, I learned a lot from your book. And I enjoyed the reading, as I expect the readers will enjoy. Our potential readers that are watching this interview will like that as well. So welcome. Thank you for your nice book. Please make a brief introduction of yourselves and tell us how you ended up knowing so much about peat.
Well, I'll start. In your introduction, you mentioned Professor Emeritus, which means I've been around for a long time and just recently retired. And just the way my career has developed, I had some interaction with some very interesting scientists, and I happened to be the committee member on Dr. Quinton's PhD thesis, and was advisor for Dr. McCarter on his master's and PhD thesis as well. So definitely been around a long time. My interest started as a master's student. I knew nothing about peat when I started, knew something, enough to know that I wanted to go on and do my PhD, and I worked in the James Bay lowland, and it's kind of spun from there. There's just so many interesting aspects of peat. It's it really crosses over between the physical world physics and ecology, so that I think all of us here are much stronger on the physics side than the ecology side, but you can't do one without the other when we're looking at peatlands.
Okay, thank you.
I think in the order that you introduced us, I think I was, but I can't really remember.
That's okay. It doesn't matter. That's okay. You're welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'll just add to John's. He recalled being my PhD on my PhD committee. He was also on my master's committee, too. So it goes back a long way. I just don't know why he looked younger than me, but anyway. But I had sort of a similar experience to what we heard from John, but different in some ways as well. I worked at early in my career in wetlands, what we would normally think of as wetlands and peatlands. Following that, I went to work further north in the Arctic tundra. And I took that sort of knowledge of peat with me, and it was a good thing that I did, because tundra is basically a continuous organic terrain. It's kind of marginal as a peatland because the peat's only 30-40 centimeters thick, and it's not a wetland except for in some limited areas. But nevertheless, it sharpened my focus on the importance of peat properties, thermal physical properties, hydraulic properties. Later on, when I went to work a little bit further south of that after my PhD research, I found myself further south in the sort of an area of discontinuous permafrost, and guess what? Peatlands everywhere. So I had a nice mixture of back in peatland, like real peatland terrain, but also having that permafrost that I knew a little bit about in my PhD studies too. So it all comes together very nicely, and adding a nice sort of twist to that is it's also in a terrain that's rapidly changing because of permafrost thaw and climate warming and so on. So understanding a bit about how peatlands evolve and devolve has served me well.
Thank you very much. So, Colin.
Thanks. Yeah, so I have a bit of a similar story, but a bit different than both John and Bill. John being my master's and PhD supervisor, and I kind of fell into that, just going in and talking to him as a grad supervisor and being interested in water, wetlands, and restoration, and having really at that time no idea that that's what John was doing out in Quebec. And that's really how I fell into peatlands and loving peatlands and everything about hydrology and the complexity that's built upon the interactions between the hydrology and the ecology and the biogeochemistry. Yeah, and Bill was also a committee member for me during my PhD, so it was quite enlightening to have both of them grilling me on my PhD defense, but a very enjoyable time during that period. But yeah, I just continued on in peatlands and just found them fascinating, delving deeper into the complexities of how water and contaminants and solutes move and interact and how they all feed back on each other. And that's kept me going, and it's currently my future plan as well, as I'll be moving up to Nipissing University for a tenure track position in the very near future. So that's my next steps and continuing on in peatlands and organic soils.
That's very nice. That's very nice. Actually, I stumbled into peat by chance. By the way, we're all Waterloo related people here. I took my PhD in Waterloo as well, and I finished in '97. And at Borden, we, supposed to be a clean sand, and we stumbled in a peat layer while we were drilling wells there, shallow wells. And I had to learn how peat works just by chance. It was quite interesting. But please, some of the people.
If I could just kind of add another comment. I mean, the linkages between us are so many you can't even describe them. And so, as a PhD student myself, I took a course with Dr. Cherry and Dr. Gillam at the University of Waterloo, examining issues related to solute transport in peat. It was really the very early stages of what we knew about it then. And it ended up that Dr. Cherry was the external on my PhD thesis at the defense.
Bob Gillam was on my defense, not John, but Bob was. That's exactly, a small world. That's very good.
Yes. Yeah.
So some of the people, like the Brazilians that I'm talking about, are people from around the world that I know. And you can see from the map that you have on your book, some places peat are not that common. So let's start from the beginning. What is peat, and what's the importance, either environmental and to groundwater? Please, maybe John, you can take it.
Sure. Well, I mean, very simply, peat is just the organic material derived from the plants that grow on it that is incompletely decomposed, and it forms the matrix for which the groundwater is held, so that the groundwater is flowing through this matrix of decomposed material, and the feedback between the groundwater and the generation of biomass results in this system. So it's kind of like the perfect example of eco-hydrology, where the hydrology is affecting the character of the system, and the character of the system is affecting the hydrology. Peat is not one thing, depending upon the nature of the system where the organic material is growing, or where this peatland is. It can have a variety of genetic sources, and some of it, much of it in the boreal zone, at least, is from one particular genus of moss, that is sphagnum mosses, which happens to be particularly hard to decompose, and so it forms a lot of the peatlands. But peatlands are also formed by sedges and so on, and different types of peatlands are formed by woody material, trees, and so that that is integral to how we to categorize them, which I can speak on. But the nature of the peat is very much a function of the the genetic origin of the material, and then the processes that have occurred over its time of accumulation, which causes the peat to change in character.
That's very good. It's very, yeah. It is quite complex when you get close. So how are peat systems as porous media then? And do we have special controls or water behavior due to the peat composition and porosity because they change?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can jump in.
Please.
Peat is a porous media and a kind of a complex, it's a bit of a complex system in that, as John said, there's many different types of peat and they all have different arrangements of pore connectivity, or shape, and tortuosity of the flow paths for the water. And so as a porous media, understanding this variety as kind of a general porous media is very difficult to do. And I mean, of all the different types of peat, we probably only have a reasonable idea of sphagnum peats because that's where most people have been researching. Whereas a lot of the woody and sedge peats, we have much less of an idea of how it really operates as a porous media. We have some good ideas from our kind of fundamental hydrology and our understanding of sphagnum peats. But the woody and sedge peats, we know much less about, especially the variety and kind of how they evolve over time. What's really interesting about peat, though, is that when we're looking at water flow as well as solutes and contaminants, there's a lot of properties of peat that makes it very interesting in that it's considered a dual porosity media, or in some people have proposed that it's a triple porosity media, and that you have a mobile active water phase where the bulk of the water is flowing, and you have an immobile phase where there's water still being retained, but it's not being transported through the pores. And then the triple porosity, you kind of have a third porosity on there, which is kind of this residual water content that's trapped in between the tiny spaces between leaves and branches, and micro porosities along the stems and other aspects like that along the stems of sphagnum moss and other vegetation. And so this creates a really a unique and complex media to work with, not only in its breadth of different types of peat, in that the ratio of mobile to immobile porosity changes if you have sphagnum peat, and even different species of sphagnum produce different types of different porous media. Then add on sedges, woody peats, they're all different, and understanding those differences is really critical to understanding the hydrology of these systems. And kind of the other really interesting thing is that peats aren't rigid. They move, and we get mire breathing, where peatlands will move up and down over a course of a season as the water table lowers and the pore spaces collapse. But then as that water plate, as the water table increases again, and the pores become filled with water again, the mire breathes back up. And so it can be a really complicated system and interesting systems to work in.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I have a personal question here when you mentioned the triple porosity. So the third part that you mentioned is like immobile mostly, or totally immobile?
Yeah, it was proposed. I think, if I remember correctly, by Tobias Weber out of his PhD work, and the third porosity is really low in the pressure, like when you're drawing water out on a say a tension disc, it's way down in the above 1,000 millibar pressure, where it's just held on very tightly to the essentially the pore walls, but in this case the pore walls are the stems and leaves of the sphagnum moss. And so this is kind of this immovable, immobile water that only gets removed at these very, very extreme pressures. And it can make up 1 to, I think the highest range is around 10% of the total porosity, which in peat can range from, at the low end, porosities of 40%, but at the high end, up to 98% of a sample can be pore space with very little kind of solid matter or peat.
To a very large extent, this discussion applies to sphagnum peat because of the structure of the plant. So that, as an accumulation of organic material, there are spaces which through which water can flow, which is the mobile porosity. But the sphagnum itself has these closed cells with a fixed opening size, which requires a threshold pressure to get the water out. So basically, they're water storage cells in the plant.
It's capillarity based.
Well, yes, but there are these they call them halocysts. But basically, there's an enclosed or a mostly enclosed space within the plant structure.
Okay, so
which holds onto the water, and the water in the mobile phase flows past that, and it's only under some threshold pressure will water come out of those cells, and then that helps to hydrate the mosses so they can continue their photosynthetic function.
Okay,
and that's of course that stuff is maintained to a certain extent as the peat decomposes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
Okay.
What about ground? You want to add something?
Oh, I was just going to build on some of these points very briefly. One of the challenges, of course, and Colin alluded to this, is that we face working in peatlands and with processes like mire breathing and so on, is the fact that you're out there and there's no reliable elevation, that you can reference for your studies. So I've often been out there with tripod in hand, and you're trying to survey something and you're yourself moving up and down. So there's lots of challenges, but I will add one factor that's really characterizes and distinguishes organic soils in terms of the hydraulic properties compared with mineral is that we often have this dramatic decrease in horizontal hydraulic conductivity with depth, and that's because we have basically, as you get deeper and deeper, you're going back in time in a sense, because you're getting to older and older sediments which have had longer and longer periods over which they can decay, break down. So your physical properties are changing, and therefore your hydraulic properties are changing, which govern the hydraulic properties, but also your thermal properties. Colin mentioned, your range in porosity. When you get up to high porosity peats, you're talking about air, right? If you're dry peat, so basically, if it's saturated peat, it's mostly water. If it's dry peat, it's mostly air, and that has huge implications for the thermal properties, because the difference in thermal conductivity is about 1,000 times between air and water. So whether you're going to have a lot of energy conducted into the ground or very little energy conducted into the ground is often governed by the near surface peat moisture content.
One of the things that I liked to tell my students when I was teaching is that when you're out standing on a peatland, you think about what you're standing on. There are more solids in a glass of milk than there are in the peatland that you're standing on.
Oh, that's a very nice way. That's why you're a professor. You have a nice way to put things. It's important. Never thought about it. Very, very good. So, what about then the groundwater contamination? Could peat be a contaminant in itself? Maybe. And what is the fate and transport on peat? Not easy stuff, is it?
I'll let Colin take that question, but I thought about it a bit beforehand, and that for the most part, we see this particulate peat in some moving water bodies, and so it can become a problem like that. But from a groundwater point of view, we wouldn't generally consider it a contaminant. Although having said that, I know in some jurisdictions, in the UK, for example, it's a big issue that there is dissolved organic carbon in the water which is collected in their reservoirs, and it comes from these organic materials which are in the uplands. And that while it's not particularly insidious in and of itself, it doesn't look very nice when it comes out of your tap. So they spend an enormous amount of money trying to figure out how to reduce that. And so that in that sense, it might be a contaminant. But, I'll let Colin take it from there, talk a bit more about contaminants being transported in peat.
Yeah. the DOC, just kind of building on John, is the dissolved organic carbon and the release of it from peat and peatlands is not only in the UK an issue, but also other jurisdictions where you have a lot of peatlands and a lot of surface water for your water treatment, such as northern Canada and some parts of the boreal Canada too. And but contaminant transport in peat is really complicated because it's the media. The media itself is organic, and so it's highly absorptive to most cationic species. But because there's so much dissolved organic matter as well as particular colloidal organic matter, you also get mobility based on complexes in these systems. And we're very much at the kind of I'd say the infancy and understanding of how these kind of coupled systems really are moving. Take mercury, for example, which is a common contaminant of concern in many boreal peatlands. We know that inorganic mercury binds with the DOM and is transported, the dissolved organic matter, and is transported within those complexes, whereas other cationic metals that we might be worried about, nickel or copper, might bind to other functional groups on that same organic molecule, and we just don't know. We don't have that understanding yet of molecular composition of how these things are transported and where they're really binding to. And it becomes even more complicated that you have this changing flow path within peat, as Bill mentioned about this kind of decline in hydraulic conductivity and peat properties with depth. It means that in a peatland, when we're talking about transport and contamination, most of the contaminant is being transported really in that surficial peat, the high hydraulic conductivity peat, right near the surface, where in some of the sphagnum dominant systems, you can get 90+% of the contaminant being transported in 10 centimeters of peat when your whole aquifer, your peat aquifer, is 2 meters or greater. And so it really becomes complicated, not just beyond the geochemical and those interactions, but just the physical hydrology and the transport becomes very complicated. And then, when we kind of go across the pond to the UK and we have blanket bogs and we have systems with a large amount of macropores, you can get kind of preferential transport of contaminants along those macropores and kind of get kind of sporadic contaminant plumes as well. It's a fairly complicated system to look at, and we're really, this is where at least some of us are putting a lot of effort into right now.
One of the things that's worth mentioning, and maybe Colin can elaborate on this, is that peatlands themselves are not important sources of contaminant, but there's some exception in the sense that in the Hudson Bay lowlands, which is over 300,000 kilometers and mostly peatland, the major rivers there have fish in them that are contaminated with mercury, and there have been advisories against eating fish for the local indigenous people going back 40 or more years. And it's not because of local processes, it's because of mercury being transported on a global scale. It has very long residence time in the atmosphere, and that the processes occurring in peatlands in particular result in the transformation of inorganic mercury to an organic form, which is mobile, highly toxic, and bioaccumulates in fish. And so that in that sense, there is a concern with contamination coming from peatlands.
I understand. So I would assume that as we go deeper and it's more decay, it absorbs more contamination. Is that true or not? Because we have more.
Well, the amount of water passing by that sediment is reduced, and so that I would say that the upper zone is more active. But yes, I think there's a lot of cations, including metals, I suppose, in some cases, that can be bound and are stored in peat for a long time. There've been some interesting studies in Europe, in particular, of long peat cores being used to evaluate the anthropogenic. No, I'm not getting the right word here, but the anthropology of the area, because they're being able to look at this transition to Iron Age cultures, and then the various industries that have been produced over thousands of years, and that kind of tied up in the record of peat. So that that's a function of the strength of that attraction of the peat to the to those metals.
Interesting. So, and how to characterize and monitor groundwater in peat then?
So, in many ways, we take the same approach as we would in other terrain types. In terms of monitoring the or characterizing the flows of water from groundwater systems into the surface water or vice versa, we need to know the gradient of the hydraulic head, and we also need to know the hydraulic conductivity. So we would use standard approaches for the gradient, and piezometer, nests, and so on. But a lot of times where the challenge comes in, which distinguishes peatland studies from other areas, is again going back to that how dramatically properties change with depth. So we have a very nonlinear system, and even where you have hydraulic conductivity, which can decrease several orders of magnitude over 40, 50 centimeters of depth, and you're evaluating groundwater upwelling through peat, you can easily get your flux calculations wrong. So we have to be careful and pay particularly close attention to those sorts of details. And the other thing that makes, that comes to mind that makes peatlands a bit more of a challenge is that the landscape's evolving. So areas of a peatland over, and it can be over relatively short periods of decades, so not, relatively short compared to other terrains. Yeah. Over a career anyway. So you can see some areas, we have preferential peat accumulation forming bogs, which eventually become perched water tables. So they may be areas that are receiving groundwater at one time, but then are raised above the local water or regional water table shortly thereafter, and they take on an entirely different groundwater relationship with the surrounding terrains. So there are these sorts of...
that yourself?
Sorry?
Have you witnessed that yourself?
I've witnessed other types of changes in groundwater, which are really resulting from transformation of landscapes due to the loss of permafrost, which really does involve the loss of what are a type of bog called the peat plateau, which is elevated above the landscape because of permafrost being below it. But when you thaw that permafrost out, it subsides, and then its relationship with surface water and groundwater changes because you've lost that aquitard, that confining layer of thick permafrost, which prevents any interactions. Take that away, and of course your surface is now able to interact with groundwater.
Okay, so monitoring could be a challenge, as I see, right? Because you have some sudden variations, either within a year when you have water changes and things like that, right?
I think it's especially one has to take special attention to the hydrological context and appreciate that it can change, and that has to be built into our monitoring methods.
Okay.
So one of the practicalities of doing monitoring on peatlands is that, well, for the most part, there are no roads going into peatlands or anywhere near peatlands, and that's not entirely true. I mean, roads do go through peatlands and cause problems, but for some of these vast peatlands, the access is extremely limited. It might be by helicopter, for example, or a very long walk.
Okay. So and how to model it then? What are the challenges for that? It's quite complicated.
Well, there are lots of models which are available for modeling peatlands. One of the things that is true about most undisturbed peatlands is that the water table is close to the surface, so that the vadose zone is small. And depending upon the question that's being asked, you might be able to ignore it and just use something as simple as mud flow to characterize the system. Although, then you have a problem with node positioning and so on on an uneven surface with that. So we in particular, and a lot of other scientists have made a lot of use of one-dimensional modeling, in particular Hydrus 1D, which is, as you know, is freely available. And it's allowed us to test a lot of different ideas about how that unsaturated zone connects the saturated zone to the atmosphere. And we've done that in particular because we're interested in what the conditions are near the surface for the plants, and in particular for the mosses, which are non-vascular. So there's no root systems. So it's the water transport up through that small vascular zone to the surface, which the mosses rely on to be able to sustain their photosynthetic processes. And so that we've made a lot of use of one-dimensional models doing that. Two-dimensional modeling is much less common. And I don't know, Colin, if you have any more to add about two-dimensional models that have really made a difference in our understanding of peatlands.
Yeah, as we increase our model size and complexity, one of the main challenges we run into with peatlands and peat is lack of a parameter space to draw from. There aren't that many studies that even say have Van Noten-Wallum parameters for peat or peatlands. There's only a handful kind of really conducted, and the fact that as we kind of mentioned, that peat is so many different types of things, it's different types of forest media, and has this wide range. It's one of the big limitations, and so this is part of the reason that we haven't scaled up to two-dimensional models kind of as en masse as a kind of a scientific group. Yeah, I definitely see kind of in the next 5 to 10 years that kind of the expansion into these two-dimensional and three-dimensional models is really where we're going to see, hopefully see a lot of our progress that might start illuminating things that we haven't considered, or we just didn't know was important to this point. The one area where we do see kind of some really complicated models at two-dimensional scales is really kind of the linking the carbon sequestration with hydrology and the ecology. And so there's a whole suite of models really focused on that, but they generally simplify the hydrology quite a bit to make it just a more parsimonious model and allow it to run with limited data, which, we are generally data limited in peatlands as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, if I could maybe just add to that. So, I mean, I guess there's a number of challenges. One of them is the development of land surface schemes, which allow the surface to communicate with the atmosphere in two directions for mass and energy. And just getting things like questions like the tree cover, how evapotranspiration rates from wetlands into the atmosphere, and how that compares with evaporation rates just from the surface of the wetlands. But there's some of the big challenges are how wetlands interact. Stepping back and looking at the larger scale, like if you have a 1 square kilometer area, we find that a lot of times the nature of interaction or water flows between individual wetlands really depends strongly on the water levels, right? So you have threshold conditions at a certain water level. You have wetlands interacting with these, and then they become hydrologically isolated from one another as the water level descends. So getting those sorts of details, numerically described, but also some wetlands are good storers of water, others shed water. There's this relation, there's this known relationships between of peatland types, their physical attributes, how that makes them perform hydrologically. So if you have a basin who's composed of a certain arrangement of wetlands, and that changes over time, you can imagine that the hydrological functioning of that basin would change as well. So there's these kinds of considerations that have to be brought in, which is a little bit different than standard sort of modeling. Yeah.
Definitely. So, what are the most important human impacts on peatlands and the feedback groundwater, please?
Well, I think, at a global scale, it's climate change, and that the jury's not out on exactly what will happen, but we know it's going to get warmer, and there's going to be water loss by evapotranspiration, and so that they have the potential to get drier. In some places, there's going to be more precipitation, but it's uncertain and perhaps unlikely that it's going to offset the water loss. And so that these wetlands are there by virtue of the water budget that was there and that they have created. And so that, with that change, there's a great deal of there's a great deal of potential impact, so that it might enhance the decomposition, for example, of carbon through putting carbon back into the atmosphere. It will change the length of the growing season. It'll change the period of snow accumulation, and so the magnitude of the snow runoff in higher latitude systems, and that is going to change the rates of decomposition. For example, it's going to change the rates and influence of groundwater inflow, which controls the vegetation composition. And so that there's a great, there's a huge number of potential feedbacks. But I think the one which is of greatest concern is that with global warming, that there's an enhanced loss of carbon, and so it becomes a positive feedback cycle.
Quite important, yeah. Well, I see here, I forgot to ask you one thing, so I'm going to ask you right now. That's quite important. So, about the categorization of the peat systems, the swamps, fens, and bogs. What are the difference? Because you have such a nice explanation on your book. Please, I think it's up to you, John.
Okay, if I may, we categorize these systems based on their hydrology, at least in theory. And I say that because we understand the hydrology, although it's very difficult to measure it in a way that allows us to categorize it. But that hydrology results in a vegetation composition which is much more easily identified, and we can associate it with the hydrology which controls it. So that as Bill mentioned before, bogs are these systems that have accumulated enough peat to isolate themselves from the regional and or local groundwater effects, so that whereas once they may have received some groundwater inflow, they've accumulated enough peat, and that peat forms a new matrix, an aquifer, and it holds the water, so the water table rises, and so that they shed water. And as a consequence of that, they are very acidic, in that the decomposing organic material is not buffered by any minerals that are coming in from groundwater. And so that's a very, very distinct category. The other categories are perhaps a little less distinct. So fens and swamps all receive, to a certain degree, groundwater inflow. And depending upon the strength of that groundwater inflow, it will affect the wetness, and depending upon the chemistry of that water and its flux, it'll affect its ability to buffer acids, and so that it changes the pH of the system, again, which controls the vegetation community. So that swamps generally form in in low-lying areas where there's strong episodic water flows. So you may have a very strong flux. It might be from a river flooding, or it might be from water which is brought in episodically by stream flow. But it has periods of time that are sufficient when the system dries out enough to support trees, because trees don't like to have their, for the most part, trees don't like to have their roots wet all the time. So that if there's enough water table drawdown for long enough periods of time, then the trees will take over and it will become what we call a swamp. Now, fens also have trees sometimes, but they tend to have much more peat and more mosses, and that the peat itself is more typically comprises decomposing mosses and sedges and so on, as opposed to woody material. So that, as I indicated, we know and we can measure the groundwater inflow to a system, but it's the groundwater inflow, as it changes through the season, as it changes or not over the years, which is key to any given system. And so that's very difficult to do in practice. And so that we rely then on what we see at the surface in terms of vegetation to be able to make that categorization. So basically, bogs have no groundwater inflow, and they're acid, and they support a rather few species, often dominated by sphagnum mosses. And there are fens, which often have mosses of a different kind. We call them brown mosses. They usually have weaker groundwater inflow, and swamps have groundwater inflow, which is more episodic. Now, having said that, I want to make an exception, because in tropical areas, they call their peatlands swamps. They do have big trees, but they can also have a raised water table or a domed water table like a bog. The difference being that in those tropical areas, there's such a large amount of rainfall that they can maintain that wetness.
That's true.
To support the peat formation, and the transpiration rates are pretty high as well, and so the trees do well there.
Yeah, that's true. I know exactly what you mean. We have lots around here. So thank you very much. That was quite interesting. Congratulations for your very well done book. We'll make sure enough interested people can reach out to your work. It's quite interesting. I'd like you to please make your final statements for our audience, please.
Okay, there's one thing that I wanted to say. When we started thinking about how to write this book, we had to decide on what level of referencing that we would use. There are a lot more references, and we didn't want this to be a literature review. And so there are lots of key references that we haven't used in this book, and it kind of lends very heavily on our own experiences, so that a lot of the work that we've been involved in, we do use because we have a good understanding of it and can relate those experiences in a way which we think is meaningful to the reader. So it's not an exercise in self-promotion by any means, but there are still a lot of very good researchers doing research on peatlands, and there are still lots of questions to answer, so that people, the young researchers, like Colin, for example, and Bill to a certain extent, still have something to do. And even myself, who I'm apparently retired, my friends are laughing at me because I still spend most of my time, or a good deal of my time, sitting up here working on various things. I'm just not getting the big paycheck anymore.
Come on, don't cry. Go.
No, I'm not. I love doing it. It's been one of the passions of my life.
For sure, I can see from your work. That's for sure.
Yeah. I know. I'll just add, it's been a real pleasure working with John and Colin, and I really appreciate John's leadership and his huge amount of experience that's really come through here. And I think, all in all, the work is, I hope it's seen as an invitation to the larger community of peatland interested people to contribute and, point out things where they'd like to see added and that kind of thing. Presumably there'll be chances down the road to update materials and so on. Look forward to that.
All right, thank you. Colin.
And John and Bill have certainly said most of the things that I was going to say, but I'll also echo Bill's sentiment that it's been a pleasure to work on this, and having John leading it was quite effective and quite a fun way to do this and to write this book. So it's been a lot of fun to do this and kind of just think about peatlands and water moving. And yeah, it's not something you get to do very often once you're past your PhD, it seems. So it's been quite enjoyable. And yeah, as you know, I definitely agree with Bill that hopefully this encourages people to put more into this book and kind of update it as we go and we learn more and kind of push the bounds of what we know about peatland hydrology and peatland science.
Well, I'm pretty sure you will. I had a very enjoyable experience reading the book because it was light to learn, and I think it's very, when we're used to reading papers, you get bits and pieces here and there, and you make yourself an image of the situation. And your book put together things that, it's easy for us to go from there and to study deeper if you're interested to. So I'm really happy with the result of the book. Then, guys, congratulations for such a nice work. I'm really happy to read the book, and I hope lots of other readers have the experience that I had, because it was really enjoyable. Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.